Good day, everyone! Londononion here, returning with yet another build for our heavy weapon wielding engineer. Accompanying today will be the weapon and ammo savvy gunslinger. First, we'll have a thorough exposition of the build, apply it to our archetype matrix, and discuss application and limitations with an assessment on boss efficacy. Let's get started. Just like our previous build, the armor is not necessarily prescriptive, but the aim is to maintain medium encumbrance with decent elemental/blight resistances. To achieve this, I mainly employ the Fey Royal Armor set, with an exception of the body plate. Instead, I go with the Red Widow Raiment, for a total weight of 48.8 units. As for the relic, I choose to go with the Enlarged Heart, purely for its efficiency and healing effectiveness. Moving on to the main weapons, the primary I equip is the Bulldog Auto Shoddy with the Song of Aether mod and Hidden Power Mutator, which increases range damage by 25% for 7 seconds after being stowed for 2 seconds. When maximized, the weapon is automatically reloaded after the 2-second stow time has elapsed. For the secondary, I go with the trusty MP60 with Scrap Shot and the Extender Mutator for a boost in ammo capacity and reload speed. Lastly, our melee weapon is not a must, but the choice lies between the Spectral Blade or the Dreamcatcher Staff. For this build, I favor the Spectral Blade for its seamless special ability, and apply the Edgelord Mutator for a boost in melee speed and lifesteal. Shielded Strike is also a viable option. Transitioning to the gorgeous jewelry, the amulet leading this build is the Whispering Marble. This grants 3 stacks of Bulwark and increases all damage by 2% per stack. As for the bands, I equip Cold Cat Eyelet, Dried Clay Ring, Ring of Ordnance, and Soul Link Ring. Cold Cat Eyelet grants a stack of Bulwark and increases health regeneration by 0.3 units per second for each stack of Bulwark. Dried Clay Ring grants a stack of Bulwark and increases all damage by 50% of the total damage reduction granted by Bulwark. Ring of Ordnance allows the engineer's heavy weapon to regenerate at 75% of its normal rate when deployed, and regeneration is doubled when stowed away. Lastly, Soul Link Ring allows summons to lifesteal 5% of their base damage as lifesteal to the caster. Moving on to the skills, for those who could tell from the VAMPIRIC VULCAN alias, the skill I employ on the engineer side is the Vulcan heavy weapon. On the gunslinger side, I employ Bullet Storm, which increases fire rate by 20% and reload speed by 50% of one's ranged weapons. Upon enemy elimination, one's weapon will instantly reload while the skill is active. As for the traits, I steal the Medic's Triage and employ Vigor, Endurance, Expertise, Bark Skin, Footwork, Recovery, Shade Skin, and Siphoner. To top this build off, the fragments I employ are range damage, casting speed, and skill damage. The supplementing prisms are casting speed, skill damage, health regeneration, range damage, and skill duration. So with the build ascertained, we'll transition to the build designation. So for those who have been present for our previous discussions, I make use of a personally constructed archetype matrix to help illustrate the main function of a given build. The left and right vertices act as poles of measurement for the dominant combat method, while the north and south poles are modifiers. Lastly, the lines act as ranked designative traits that are present to varying degrees. For the purpose of consistency, Predators will be defined as close quarters and/or melee-oriented builds, with a reactive blitzkrieg-like answer to enemy encounters. Tacticians will be defined as range-oriented builds, with a proactive, attritional answer to enemy encounters. Specializations refine the main offensive method for optimized carnage and execution. Naturally, such builds are narrow in attack pattern and may struggle in a number of circumstances that aren't conducive to the highlighted offensive method. However, they are unparalleled when successfully executed. Dynamos diversify offensive/defensive avenues for having an answer to a wide range of enemies/circumstances. Such builds may give way to overly convoluted/segmented operation, or inhibited offense due to a lack of simplified capitalization, but will rarely be left without an effective answer. To determine the designation, we'll look at our evaluation of function. The more nuanced our evaluation, the more dynamic the build is. The more lopsided, the more specialized it is. Starting with offensive capability, highest on the tier list is the greatest and most frequent damage numbers. The answer to this one is heavily nuanced. The auto shoddy will have the best burst damage and damage over time, but the frequency easily goes to the MP60. As for the Engineer's VULCAN gun, its frequency is in the middle, but the damage output is heavily influenced by its positioning. When stationary, DPS is last, and when held, DPS is the highest. The melee weapon damage is unimpressive, and the special ability unsustainable, and would be on par with the stationary VULCAN. Long story short, I would call this a circumstantial three-way tie, so ease of execution is next to consider. The VULCAN automatically takes last due to deployment and charge time. Both the Bulldog and MP60 have a commensurately easy use in this onion's opinion. They will just be appropriate for slightly different circumstances. The Spectral Blade is also easy to use and can deal damage to all targets within a very short range. For practicality/applicability, the VULCAN is quite useful for targets at all ranges, especially when overclocked. Given the intended nature of this build, heavy carry mode will likely come with more detriments than benefits, but that will be explored a bit later. The Spectral Blade has strong practicality in specific circumstances of being surrounded and overwhelmed, but is otherwise obsolete in the face of other offensive options. The Bulldog and MP60 have increasing/diminishing practicality based on range. The closer the range, the more practical, though there is such a thing as too close with these firearms. When venturing to the mid to far range, the stationary VULCAN becomes more efficacious. So the offensive capability is nuanced with the Bulldog and MP60 taking a close lead while the other offensive options act as supplements. Moving on to the defensive/restorative capability, health restoration has a series of small avenues. Soul Link, however, is the only one with specific activation, that being the Engineer heavy weapon when stationary. The Edgelord Mutator is also a small avenue, though its use in comparison is sparing at best. And this is compounded with Siphoner and Triage. Everything else is neutral. This build is devoid of shield use, unless applying the Shielded Strike Mutator on our melee weapon, so we will jump straight to damage reduction. The main bulk of damage reduction is due to our rings and amulet. Otherwise, further damage reduction can be achieved from the heavy weapon when within 2.5 meters. However, this is most easily achieved when in carry mode. Moving on to build synergy, amulet and ring enhancements are general or otherwise pointed toward buffing the heavy weapon's capability, with Ring of Ordnance and Soul Link. Now, ever since the recent update with the Shard and Prism system, this onion has decided that Shard enhancements will be given greater priority over skill enhancements, and be placed in the middle of the synergy spectrum. But anyways, our main fragments are range damage, skill damage, and casting speed, which again works for both main weapons and the heavy weapon. The alternative prism enhancements compound on the fragments, with the exception of health regeneration and skill duration. Health regeneration remains neutral, while skill duration can work for both Overclocked and Bulletstorm. There is no clear winner here, but intention is also important to consider. Casting speed was mainly intended to address the VULCAN heavy weapon deployment, though Bulletstorm and the attached mods would technically still benefit. Moving on to skill enhancements. Now this is generally a close-ranged build, with the VULCAN as the only variable option. However, there's not much incentive to carry the heavy weapon, especially given the efficacy of our other options. More of the advantages of the build can be reaped while one's hands are free, so to speak. Bulletstorm is a direct augmentation of one's firearms, which does not require much explanation, but this only incentivizes use of the primary and secondary weapons. So given our nuanced evaluation of function, our Vampiric VULCAN would be on the dynamic pole. The majority of combat effectiveness resides at close range, putting it on the Predator pole. Consequently, I would designate this build as a fighter. Fighters prioritize melee/close range combat, with supplemental far-ranged and proactive ability. Metaphorically, fighters are the MMA combatants of shooting, varied in skill set without a particular specialty, but clear prowesses in certain disciplines, and this will transition us to a brief discussion on how this build is intended to function. Starting off with the heavy weapon, the Engineer's Vulcan is mainly intended to be stationary. This will allow consistent activation of Soul Link and will supplement the offensive efforts of the Vampiric Vulcan. Due to our weapon choices, this build gets the most done when closer to enemies, and this is why this onion built toward maximized bulwark stacks. Also, our armor is not particularly impressive. While in the thick of combat, receiving damage, especially significant damage, is made far easier, and being able to dodge quickly or frequently is necessary to survive. Hence, medium encumbrance was prescribed. Typically, when encountering numerous enemies, one should place their heavy weapon on the ground and engage their targets with whichever option is appropriate. More often than not, this onion puts the Vulcan into autonomous mode to eliminate different targets simultaneously. To maintain heightened damage, one would have to make frequent switches between their primary and secondary weapons. This is to take consistent advantage of the hidden power mutator on the Bulldog. Once the 7 seconds have elapsed, one would have to expend roughly 30 rounds, or fire for 2 seconds, from the MP60 before switching back to the Bulldog, which should be reloaded by then. Reloading the MP60 will also take approximately 2 seconds, so this can also be worked into one's firing pattern to maintain a healthy damage boost. Now, optimized damage is a bit more tricky to achieve, due to the dynamic nature of this build. One would have to have overclocked activated, bullet storm, employing the firing pattern as previously described, and have the turret in guided targeting mode so that it shoots at whatever one is aiming at. Scrapshot on top of this will create the greatest output. Though personally, this onion prefers to stagger these strategies, so as to maintain augmented damage over a long period, as opposed to optimized damage for a short period of time. But that is up to each Paxel tech to decide. A low saturation of tough targets could warrant the optimized option, and high saturation of weak targets would warrant the augmented option. Now, although I designate this build as a fighter type, the melee weapon takes a back seat, and mainly has its niche with numerous but frail enemies. The second function would be kiter, which is fulfilled by the stationary heavy weapon. Third function is cannon for when carrying the heavy weapon, and Juggernaut is fulfilled by the Spectral Blade as the least significant function. The key to success with this build is aggression, and maintaining nearly unrelenting offense with the array of tools and flexibility. Now, carrying the heavy weapon is encouraged when exploring low enemy saturated areas. This is primarily to aid with ammo conservation and replenishment, but any major encounters will likely leave this build annoyingly blindsided and will demand a more proactive approach to combat, which is, by our own definition, not a strength of this build. To dig a little deeper into our application and limitations, we'll move on to boss efficacy. Now, there are 3 categories I break bosses down to. Similar to our archetype matrix, they are brawlers, sentries, and dynamos. Brawlers are melee-oriented and constantly bring the fight to you. They tend to exercise area of effect attacks, but with varied range capability. They are more likely to have armored weak spots, if any at all, and devastating blows. Sentries are extremely difficult to strike directly, while the bulk, if not all, of their offense is ranged-based. Their vulnerability tends to have a variable state. They have a greater likelihood of minion reliance, and will force a player's attention on evasion over offense, or what this onion will call a forced trial. Dynamos are a varied mixture of ranged and melee-based attacks, complicated / attention-splitting fight patterns, map manipulation, and high maneuverability are primary markers of dynamos. Just like before, we'll draw 3 names from our boss hat fitting for each designation to test the efficacy of our Vampiric Vulcan. For today's discussion, we have the Sunken Witch, Bloat King, and Corruptor. Starting off with the Sunken Witch, this one fits the brawler profile, but in the most basic way. Her offense is pretty much constant, predictable, and devastating. In regards to devastation, her insta-get potential is high, as her attacks can take off 50% or more of one's health, despite our damage reduction numbers. There otherwise does not seem to be much prowess in knockdown or blight / negative status effects. Her weak spot is her head, which is always vulnerable. The only challenge is targeting, since her offense is constant. She technically does not have traditional AoE attacks, but her repetitive spinning attack can function as area denial. One can dodge through it if done properly and with correct stamina. This onion prefers to butt scoot away, though having her break open alternative pathways is far more practical. This leads us into her dynamic effect of map manipulation. The arena itself is a major aspect of the challenge. It is painfully cramped, and one must rely on her attacks to create pathways of evasion, and ideally, a loop of some sort, making it difficult for one to get cornered. Otherwise, she will become periodically unavailable and spawn a group of minions, which this onion would also consider a forced trial. There is no special strategy for taking on the Sunken Witch, other than proper distance management and not becoming greedy with inflicting damage. The cramped space makes it easy to get cornered. Additionally, one's heavy weapon is a hazard if in the line of fire. Her minions can be devastating without the use of widespread attacks. The Spectral Blade, or this onion's preference, Scrap Shot, will do the trick of eliminating them quickly. Otherwise, keep shooting, and victory will be assured no problem. Moving on to the Bloat King, this one is a sentry with absolutely no physical attacks. It has heavy minion reliance in frequency, saturation, and variety. It is important to note that most minions are below the combat area, which is part of the challenge of this arena. The offense of the Bloat King requires constant readjustment from slow-moving and homing projectiles. The Bloat King also has varied vulnerability. Its weak spot is the floating orb, and comes with a shield that eventually dissipates or can be destroyed. The Bloat King itself and its weak spot are heavily distant, being out of strike range and with constant mobility. While the orb is active, the Bloat King goes into an armored state and has a dynamic effect of attention-splitting offense. One has to shoot while dodging the homing projectiles and also target the correct one, as there will be a decoy orb set out as well. In this battle, one's heavy weapon while stationary is their most reliable offensive means. The MP60 and Bulldog are subpar at best for inflicting damage due to the distance. Part of the challenge, just like the Sunken Witch, is distance management, which is extremely important. The arena is a series of platforms and segmented pathways, which make it rather easy to fall into the pit of mini bloats, let's say. Though this is a typically dangerous area to be in, if the heavy weapon is deployed, the Soul Link effects can rescue one from fatal damage, especially while climbing those annoying ladders. Provided one can dodge the Bloat King's attacks, victory should be easily assured. Moving on to our last boss, Corruptor. This one was a difficult dynamo to designate, but this onion would conclude that it has more of a sentry edge, but is also strong in the brawler side as well. Now the Guardian and the Corruptor are intimately tied as one, but technically the Guardian is a minion that separates itself into more minions. Plus, the Corruptor itself has a swarm of flyers that will periodically attack at random, or while the Guardian is incapacitated, giving it heavy minion reliance. The Corruptor's weak spot is periodically available, particularly when attacking, roaring, or reviving the Guardian. Lastly, it's always out of strike range. The Corruptor itself has one area denial attack, which is its only attack, though it is highly devastating. Bit of a one-trick pony. The brawler tactics are mainly exhibited by the Guardian. It has a radial wave upon landing after a jump, and this plays into its devastation with high insta-get potential and knockdown/stun capability. The blue swords it issues hurl electrical projectiles that cause an overloaded status effect with high damage. The Guardian itself has a dynamic effect of high maneuverability, while the Corruptor adds the attention-splitting offense with its area denial and flyer swarms. The most effective strategy I've had with this build is placing the heavy weapon just in front of the Corruptor and setting it to autonomous firing, while the Explorer takes on the Guardian and its swords. The swords are easily taken down to the close-range prowess of the Vampiric Vulcan. When the Guardian is vulnerable and recalling its fallen arms, Bulletstorm can be employed to increase damage output on its weak spot. Once the Corruptor has called forth the Flyer Swarm, the heavy weapon should be redeployed, with guided targeting to aid with taking down flyers. Unfortunately, in my experimentation, autonomous firing causes the heavy weapon to target the fallen Guardian. As long as one stays close to the exits of each platform, it is only a matter of time before one gains victory. The heavy weapon similarly to the Bloat King battle, will be doing more of the heavy lifting against the Corruptor. But once the Corruptor is vulnerable, that is the perfect time to capitalize on compounded damage with the heavy weapon and hidden power of the Bulldog. Now, this boss efficacy evaluation is not intended to be exhaustive, as bosses for each category will vary, and the attributes can naturally be mixed. Some sentry bosses will have some brawler traits and vice versa, but this discussion serves as a rough blueprint for how our vampiric Vulcan can fare under the circumstances that generally come with each type, using a few key examples. Now, I construct these builds with the philosophy of you can't lose if you don't die. They are ultimately meant to be generally effective enough to have an answer in virtually every circumstance, provided one's skill, or lack thereof, is not the reason for their demise. However, every archetype and pairing will have their fair share of weaknesses, based on their natural abilities and the biomes they explore. My designations of archetypes and bosses is experimental, and is consequently open to revision. As we construct and explore more builds, our categories may be subject to change or addition. Otherwise, that concludes our build for today. It's been Londononion, and I will see you guys next time.